thanks so much for being with us. Well, it seems the message of brotherhood and glad tidings during the Muslim holy month of Ramadan has overlooked Saudi Arabia. Riyadh has cut ties with Doha and is kicking out Qataris from the kingdom. Riyadh has blocked its Persian Gulf cousins by land, sea, and air. And to top it off, the Saudis, along with Bahrain and the United Arab Emirates, have sanctioned Qatar. All this because the Saudis blamed the Qataris for supporting terrorists, something Doha denies. Stay with us as we take a closer look at this row between Doha and Riyadh.
Cracks are emerging in the Saudi-led Middle East alliance, with Qatar acting as a catalyst to speed up the collapse of the alliance. Qatar has stopped its participation in the Saudi-led war on Yemen. Saudi Arabia and its allies claim they themselves have demanded Qatar stop its participation. The war began on March the 26th, 2015, and it has so far left over 12,040 Yemenis dead, while reducing much of the nation's infrastructure to rubble. Riyadh has gained almost nothing from the invasion of Yemen, as its goal has been to restore former President Abd Rabbuh Mansur Hadi, an objective which has been elusive to date. The future of the so-called Saudi-led coalition now hangs in the balance, with the division going deeper and amid reluctance on the part of some other JCC members to push ahead with the Yemen war. The Qatar factor has also affected the Saudis' plans for Syria.
Qatar is hardly a terrorist state in comparison with Saudi Arabia or Israel or the United States, for that matter. So this is an unbelievably hypocritical cover story. The Donald recently visited Saudi Arabia and appears to have given tacit permission, just as did April Gillespie for Saddam Hussein in relation to Kuwait in 1990, for Saudi Arabia to take Qatar. It's very, very troubling.
Both Riyadh and Doha have supported anti-government militant groups in Syria. They have spent billions of dollars on the war on Syria without making any gains. The diplomatic crisis in the Persian Gulf will further complicate the situation for Saudi Arabia, which sees itself in an already lost rivalry with Iran. Tehran and Riyadh support opposing sides in Syria. Qatar has shown willingness to have normal ties with Iran despite their dispute over Syria. This is to be one reason behind the Saudis' anger at Doha.
It's very appropriate that Qatar should be expressing an openness and willingness to discuss these issues, which are completely fabricated.
The Saudi regime's recent setbacks across the Middle East, including its failure to topple the Syrian government through its proxies, have made it feel isolated more than ever before. The kingdom considers itself a regional power, but the recent developments have casted doubt on Riyadh's capability to rally even its closest allies behind a cause.
I'd like to welcome my guest to the program out of Washington, D.C., Mr. Michael Springman, former U.S. diplomat in Saudi Arabia, and also out of D.C., founder of American Institute for Foreign Policy, Mr. Michael Lane. Thank you both for being with us. Well, let's start off with Michael Lane. What do you think this dispute between the Saudis and the Qataris is really about?
Well, there is a vision that Saudi Arabia has of the region where they are the most influential player, where everyone who is part of their coalition shows deference to them in terms of how they see their foreign policy and how they see their regional interests, all the same as Saudi Arabia's. And they would like to keep that as the preeminent method of keeping order in the region. That it appears at this point anyway that Qatar has strayed a little bit too far from the party line, as Saudi Arabia would see it. There are differences that they have in terms of the way they see their own national interests, and Qatar has shown some independence from the Saudi-led coalition in terms of establishing its own policies. For instance, it gets along a lot better, has much better relations with the government of Iran than does the rest of the Gulf nations. Another key part of the whole thing, of course, is the news outlet Al Jazeera, which is funded by Qatar and has carte blanche to provide critical commentary of the other regimes throughout the region, but somehow doesn't seem to provide any critical commentary of the royal regime in Qatar. So Saudi Arabia is trying to stress it flex its muscles. It's trying to stress that it is the one with the correct vision, and that everybody else ought to get in line. And the Qatari government has not been willing so far to go along with that.
Okay. Michael Springman, your thoughts on what Michael Lane has said, and I want to know about, is it just a coincidence or not that this situation has taken place after U.S. President Donald Trump's visit to the region?
Well, I think Mr. Lane pretty much encapsulated the situation, as did your summary at the beginning of the program. According to something I saw in the French press agency, Agence France Presse, the Saudis should realize that when you're in a hole, you should stop digging. And that's their problem. They seem to have an overweening sense of their own importance, their own capabilities, their own political leadership in the region, and about all they've done with the disastrous war against Yemen, and now this remarkably insane full-court press against Qatar, shows that they are losing everywhere, politically, economically, and stability. The country has, there's some 32 million Saudis, and they're terribly distressed at what 300,000 Qataris have said about Iran. Let's not fight the Iranians. Let's spend our time working to improve ourselves and supporting Palestinian rights and things like this. Yet, when Donald Trump went to Saudi Arabia, he gave them the impetus and gave them the go-ahead, from what I could see, to go after Qatar and shut everything down. People are, some 11,000 people are in danger of losing their jobs, losing their education, having their families split up, because these people, the Qataris that are abroad in the GCC countries and the kingdom, they're simply told to go home and leave their families behind. It's an incredible thing, and the Israelis love it. They have commented that they think that they ought to do more against fighting the terrorist Qataris, who have done nothing more than support one group of terrorists in Syria while the Saudis supported other ones. Mm-hmm. And they did the same thing in Libya and so forth.
Okay. Well, what about Michael Lane? The Saudis, as our other guest said, have a full court press going on. They want absolute allegiance now from the Qataris. What exactly does this mean when Qatar is supposed to be an independent country? And of course, countries can agree on some things and can disagree on others. But it seems that the Saudis take a very, very strict and harsh line with this. Why do you think that that is the case?
Well, they do take a strict and harsh line on it, and they are hopeful of increasing their own influence and their own dominance in the region as a result, with the theory being that the diplomatic row and the embargo of Qatari would quickly bring the Qatari government back in line. I think they've miscalculated somewhat on this. There's not going to be a quick capitulation on the part of the Qataris to see everything Saudi Arabia's way. In fact, what I think is you'll see some diplomatic niceties. There will be several concessions, minor concessions, relatively minor, made by Qatar that will allow them essentially to continue business as usual. It will allow Saudi Arabia to claim that their actions had merit and they won. And it will allow the coming together, the reforming of the entire GCC back in the region with one under one particular goal, which is the counterbalance to Iran. Now, that doesn't mean that Qatar is going to see everything Saudi Arabia's way. In fact, they're not. They're still going to carry on their relations. In fact, they're required to carry on relations with Iran as a result of the joint ownership of the energy field there. It's just, absolutely massive, and there needs to be cooperation for both countries to benefit from that, and there will be. But you'll see some minor concessions. Perhaps the Qataris will use some additional influence on Hamas in terms of pushing a peace process. Perhaps the journalistic tone of Al Jazeera will calm down just a little bit before it goes back to where it was.
Okay.
But the whole thing will smooth over with minor concessions.
Well, Michael Springman, let me just read this quote. We want to see Qatar stop supporting terrorist groups, and we have cut ties with great pain. Now, this is according to Saudi Foreign Minister Adel Al-Jubeir. Your take on this with the excuse of terrorism being used for the reason that these ties have been cut?
Well, I think it's outrageously hypocritical. The Saudis apparently think they can pick and choose between various terrorist groups, and whether or not Hamas is a terrorist group is up in the air. The Qataris see them as a Palestinian rights group. So the Saudi foreign minister maybe should rethink his viewpoint. The Saudi actions have brought the Turks back into the picture. They're supporting Qatar. They're supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, the Ikhwan. And I think they're playing up to Erdogan in Turkey. He's unhappy because he didn't get what he wanted from Washington. And the Saudis are unhappy with him because they don't like his attitude. But what he's doing now is talking about moving 5,000 Turkish soldiers into a base in Qatar on the peninsula, the same place where there's a huge American base, Al Udeid. And the bizarre thing is, despite what the Saudis want, the American government seems to want two different things. Donald Trump wants to push against Qatar and the Shia branch of Islam, while at the same time, Qatar and Turkey and the Brotherhood are working together.
So let me just jump in here. What exactly
really
does that mean? Mr. Spring, what exactly does it mean that the United States want to push against Qatar? As you've just mentioned, the biggest American base in the region is there. So how do those two go together?
Mm-hmm. They don't. The Defense Department and the Pentagon, they are emphasizing the need to hold together and work together against alleged terrorism, and the State Department, again, is backing itself loose from Trump's viewpoint and saying we ought to negotiate an end to this, and is talking with Russia and other countries in the region trying to calm the situation down. Yet Donald Trump pushes this idea that Qatar is somehow in bed with the monstrous terrorists of all the world, and it doesn't make any sense whatsoever.
Okay, well, Michael Lane, do you think what we're seeing is indicative of the Saudis' takfiri roots, basically having less tolerance for others and less regard? When Riyadh cut ties, it immediately cut off all land, sea, and air connections to Qatar. 40% of Doha's food items even come by land from Saudi Arabia, and this has all been done during the month of Ramadan. Why do you think that the Saudis have reacted in such a harsh way with Qatar?
Well, they're trying to make their point and bring it to a quick resolution on their own terms. Saudi Arabia would not like to see this play out. The longer it plays out, the less of a chance I think there is that the Qataris agree to what the Saudis say. So they want a quick resolution on their own terms, and that's why they were harsh. They were trying to show, okay, look, we can bring this really to the end. You can't survive without our economic partnership and our security partnership. Take that, for what it's worth, and see things our way. Well, there are other partners throughout the world that, although they can't be assembled immediately, Qatar does have options. And there is no option for Saudi and the United States to lose Qatar as an ally. They may not be the best ally. In fact, from the United States point of view, they actually, and not just Donald Trump's, but from the United States point of view, they actually are active supporters of terrorism in certain spots. But nonetheless, they're an important enough ally that we need to keep them with us, and Saudi Arabia needs to keep them within the GCC. Now, you did mention one thing I'd like to comment on, which is that you can sort of pick and choose among terrorist groups, and that's exactly what's going on over there. Is that one useful idiot to country A is a terrorist group to country B. And the same thing, country B, views a terrorist group as a useful idiot, helps them out because they are the enemy of their enemy, whereas country A has a different viewpoint on that as well. So they are picking and choosing among terrorist groups.
And in the meantime, with this picking and choosing,
work out as well.
And in the meantime, with this picking and choosing causing chaos in the region, let us say. Well, Michael Springman, some Qatari citizens who've been in Mecca for the pilgrimage have reported that they were not allowed to enter the Grand Mosque. Of course, this being against Islam. Again, I want to look at the overall lack of tolerance of the Saudis. And isn't that indicative of what we see with many of these terrorist groups who have that same takfiri perspective?
Mm-hmm. Well, it goes back to the Wahhabi perspective we're right, everybody else is wrong. We have the idea of the one true God, the one true way to that God, and everybody else is simply a non-person, a non-human, a member of a heretical faith. So it's just a continuation of what the Saudis have been doing since the 18th century, really.
How likely, though, is this to backfire? Especially now when we see before, of course, the Saudis very anti-Iran, and then some would say because Iran has a different perspective, or Islamically, they were saying. But we look at the Qataris, the cousins right there on side of them, and see the harsh reaction, the harsh response. Do you think that we're likely to see this backfire on Riyadh?
Yes, I do think it will backfire on Riyadh. They're already losing the respect of a good bit of the world, especially countries in the region who see this. The Saudis have gone to such extremes now that they are forbidding hotels to show Al Jazeera TV in their establishments, and if they do, they're fined the equivalent of $26,000. If you're a private citizen and watching this stuff on Al Jazeera, they're going to be fined $2,700. So it's just a remarkable head in the sand kind of thing, and an ignorance of reality, ignorance of other countries, ignorance of people's rights. For example, forbidding people to go to the Masjid al-Haram in Mecca. It violates not only Islam, but it violates their religious rights to worship as they please. So it's the Saudi way or no way, and I think it's going to backfire on them eventually, if it hasn't already.
Yeah, and you talked about fines actually in some of these Persian Gulf countries, along with Saudi Arabia and Bahrain and the UAE, actually people who are caught defending actually Doha can also be fined. But Mr. Lay, do you think that now Qatar will just start forming new alliances, and some of these Persian Gulf Council members are treating it in the way that it is?
Well, that's certainly the fear, I think, from the United States State Department, is that Qatar does have options. And they don't, although they've been a very long-term ally of the United States and a member of the GCC, that's not their only option. It's worked out very well for them over a number of decades, and it can continue to work out well for them under a number of decades in the future if this crisis can be resolved on an expeditious and minor concession basis. And I think that's really where Secretary Tillerson has been trying to steer this. to get the sides together, to get them to resolve their differences without one side or the other losing diplomatic face over the whole thing.
Well, you say that Tillerson is
and
probably trying to, sorry to interrupt you. You say that Tillerson is trying to get this resolved, but many would say that much of this conflict actually started when Trump was in the region. So what's going on as far as policy from Washington in your perspective, Michael Lane?
Well, Donald Trump has a flair for the dramatic. He always has. When he was in business, when he was in television, he always has a flair for the dramatic. I think that you should look at his tweets where he stakes out a position not as official U.S. policy, but as a expression of where our beginning negotiating stance is. This is where we're starting our negotiations. Donald Trump would love the Qataris to diminish and eliminate their support of various terrorist groups as defined by the United States. He would also love Saudi Arabia and other countries to do so as well. Clearly there's enough blame to go around here on a lot of different sides. So while Secretary Tillerson is working diplomatically behind the scenes and sometimes in front of the scenes to make the coalition work, to bring things back together, to get the end of the diplomatic crisis resolved, you see Donald Trump expressing the first part of the negotiation, which is we have to stop this funding of terrorism. And that puts the question in the mind of the Qatari leader, Donald Trump doesn't want us to do this. We have a long-standing relationship. Maybe we need to tone that down. But in the past, the precedent has been when there's been a difference between the White House and the various departments, the White House has traditionally, under the Trump administration, the White House has deferred to the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State.
All right, let me get Michael Springman back in on this 30 seconds I only have left. Your take on all this, how do you see it, this resolving itself?
Well, I think eventually it's going to wind itself down. The Saudis have so extended themselves or dug them so deep into a hole that they're going to either need a rope ladder or a couple of big, strong men to haul them out. I think that there isn't much the Qataris can give up that would satisfy the Saudis or the rest of the GCC countries. I think that they're eventually going to have to tone down their rhetoric and go back to the status quo ante, or else they're going to wind up in an even deeper hole with a lot of nasty alligators at the bottom.
All right, and on that note, brings us to the end of this debate. Appreciate you guys being with us. Mr. Michael Springman, former U.S. diplomat in Saudi Arabia out of D.C. Also, Michael